So I'm just going to go ahead and kick us off today. So I'm going to start with just a kind of really basic question of who was Sally Gabori, where was she from, and what do we know about her early life before she began painting?
Should the old woman talk about the old woman?
Yes, I think. Wait, which old woman?
Okay.
Where's the old?
Sally was born probably in 1928 on an island off the Gulf of Carpentria in Queensland. And she got married there when she was pretty young. She was the wife, there were 4 wives. She lived off hunting, fishing, and gathering until roughly the 1950s, when people were dispossessed of their land and they were forced to go to another island called Mornington Island, which was extremely, and because it was in the state of Queensland, they had a very repressive policy against Aboriginal people. Their children were taken away from them, they were placed into dormitories. So very much the same kind of experiences that Native American people have gone through. But Sally continued to have a very traditional life even on Mornington Island. And then at the tender age of 78, I think, she was placed into an old people's home where she was absolutely bored to death. And one day in 2005, somebody said to her, "Why don't you come to the Arts Center?" And she was the only woman who was invited. By then she was 81. And the men were doing very different kind of artwork. And she just loved that canvas and those acrylic paints. So if either of you want to add something.
Well, I think one of the things that we should say, who here has actually seen much Aboriginal Australian art? We got a few people who's been to Australia. Okay, that's cheating, but that's, anyway. So one thing that we would usually start with at Kligiru is just a reminder that I always like to quote Marcia Langton. Marcia Langton, the great Aboriginal academic, who said, there were no Aborigines until Captain Cook arrived. Right? And what she's getting at there is she's pointing out that actually there is no Aborigines. There are conservatively 250, 300 different language groups of people. Sally Gabori, who we're talking about today, is a very singular artist. Her work is extraordinarily individual, but it also belongs to a tradition. It belongs to one tradition of 350. It also belongs to the moment that it's made in. And so when Françoise talks about, say the migration of the Kayadil people from Bentnick Island to Mornington Island, right? That's a very specific history. It is a history that is really also quite recognisable to Indigenous peoples all across the world, these movements. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting in this story is on the one hand, there's a lot of things that you could say, well, these are all the same things. But then we've also got a very singular artist here. So I guess when we were practicing this talk, one of the things that I think we really kind of want you to take away is that here there's this very individual artist, but she's also belonging to 2 or 3 or 10 different histories, histories of, what have we got there? Histories of colonisation, histories of movement and dispossession, that look much more global, but they're also articulated very specifically in this one place. What have we forgotten?
I think, I'll just add in a little bit that I think that, and I work on a kind of global perspective, my work now is mostly in North America, but colonization happens at different rates in different places and different times. And in this region of Australia, it was really the most extreme in the mid-20th century, which feels very late. But up until that point, and in Sally Gabori's young life, she had been able to really live on her traditional territory with all of her traditional practices, which I think that it really adds to the story of her and as an artist, and really understanding that moment that she came in, and just how extreme it was for those generations that came after her to be in it, to be totally removed. So that's, if we can imagine hundreds of years having to change, like, not that societies are back, but just that, like, all of the cultural knowledge that you have coming into collision and being forced to be kind of silenced, shut down, and quieted in a matter of years. It's traumatic, it's extreme, and it's happened at different rates in a lot of the world at different times.
Maybe we can say something about the art, right? So Sally was an avid weaver, and in the Kayakdil language, it's very rich in the description of color and landscape. So, she lives on an island. There's a very, very beautiful language about the different color of water and the movement on the land, etc. And a lot of the blocks of colors that you see here are evoking this land, right? That she walked through, that she tracked animals, that she went hunting and she went gathering. Sorry, I should not touch my mic, I know. So that's also something, we want to emphasize, that this is not an art that comes from absolutely nowhere, that in fact a lot of crayon paintings that were given to Indigenous people in Australia in the 30s, in the 40s, and in the 50s, you have similar patterns where people are using the crayons to have those big spaces colored and interacting with one another. And when you ask them, so what is this? And they would say, well, that's my country, right? And so it's in some ways, if you can think of an aerial view, right, of the country, that's exactly what you see here with playing with colors and memory. And a lot of Indigenous people in Australia were given new material, so canvas, paper, crayons, acrylic, and they're really reframing the aesthetic expressions with that, right? So it's new, but it's also to express the old, to express themselves, to express their memories, and to express the profound attachment to the land that defines them.
So can I ask a question then? Because Françoise, you were really there at the very beginning of painting at the community of Juwarnda, which is in the desert. And when people talk about Juwarnda, they often talk about that injection of colour, that insertion of brightly painted acrylics, which is quite different to what some of the other desert communities have been doing. What do you think is different here in 2005 with Sally Gabori's work compared to 1984 when you were starting out at the beginning?
I was not there.
Well.
Okay, so it's different. I mean, I think people, Indigenous people, had been exposed to the art from other groups in Australia. I don't know how much Sally seen, but she definitely seen a lot from on the island. There was an art co-op where people would come and create sculptures and create paintings and create drawings. So she was definitely, kind of introduced to this. What's different? I mean, I think I would, instead of thinking about what's different, I would think more about what's similar, and how those paintings, they're all about sociality, right? All about relationship, right? So relationship to land, relationship to your memory, relationship to your husband. Some of them, I think this one is her husband's country or something. It's all about being in dialogue, so creating art that is in dialogue with people, that is in dialogue with your land, that is in dialogue with your memory, and that's in dialogue with yourself. Right? They're happy. And Sally produced paintings non-stop when she started. And I've seen this happen with other people in different communities. They just love it. I mean, they're just so happy to produce, because first of all, this is something that really means something to them. And the colors are different.
It is. It's very joyful painting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really important part of it. I also think, I mean, it's important to point out that Sally was working on an island. So these are paintings that are very invested in water. in a different way, I think, to desert paintings, where because that's the kind of paintings that a lot of people have seen of desert paintings, which are finding joy and colour in a very harsh, arid landscape. But here we've got these paintings that I think, to me, they're very fluid, right? All of these paintings are dealing with a kind of fluidity that feels much more watery to me, right? It feels like it has really clear synergies to some of the other coastal works, which are, you mentioned before about the multiple ways of describing water and thinking about the ways in which saltwater and freshwater and brackish water unite places and people and have these flows. And I think there's some of that flow and movement that's going on in here, I think.
What do you both think about the colours? Marina?
Yeah, so I think that I'm always struck by that topographical nature of a lot of paintings, but I think that what's interesting is that you can imagine, I'm also from an island originally, and so I feel like you can get a sense of the communication of like texture and different kinds of lands within the kind of blocks of color. And in a way, islands are very bright and colorful places, so even if they may not map exactly onto what you're thinking, I think you can really see the different topography that's there, expressed in this, visual language that's new to her, but also kind of that she's inventing from not having, other examples of this within her community. But I also just wonder if we can maybe back up a little bit, since a lot of our audience is maybe a little bit unfamiliar with Aboriginal Australian art, about what we mean when we say country, because it's quite particular here. And when she says something like my country, my father's country, King Alfred's country, we're not talking about like Western music, right? We're talking country here is being used in a particular way. So can we...
We're also talking about country music too, to some extent, yeah.
Go on, you.
I always get the difficult questions. So, in a nutshell, you inherit traditionally your country through your father's family. We all together? Yeah? Okay, right. And then you're the guardian for the country on your mother's side. And those relationships are reciprocal. So, if both of us are brother and sister, we are going to inherit our land from our father's family, but we're also the guardian of our mother's family. And if you are my mother, I'll be your country's guardian. So when she's saying my country, she could be referring to many things. She could be referring to the country she inherited from her father. She could also be talking about the country where she was conceived. And she could also be talking about the country that she's supposed to look after, which is her mother's country. Now, when she says my father's country, it's definitely a specific site that she's talking about, but that site could also be in the water. Doesn't have to be on the ground. So that's another thing I want to point out. For people on an island, they don't see land, right? So they see water. Right? Land happened to be in the water, right? So it's a very different kind of conception, vision of the world.
But remembering that every body of water has a name, right? So, and those names are ancestral. Those names are laid down in those places from the beginning of time. You can't just call up Google and ask them to change the names of those land bodies, because they're inherent to the ways in which those places were created. The other important part of that country element, I think, which brings us to some of the sensuousness of this painting, is the sense that if you were born of that place, you are going to be sharing identity, substance with that place. And so, I wonder, Françoise, when you look at these, whether you think a bit about, when Sally Gabori is putting paint on a canvas, I think there is a level of embodiment going on here that, maybe we'll just throw this crazy idea out that here we have paintings that are not just topographical maps, not just landscape paintings, but also, in a way, self-portraits as well. Is that a controversial idea, or do you think we can push that further?
Yeah, I think we can push it.
Go on.
Can
I
push
can't
it.
say them all. Your great body
Well,
painting and translation
it's
essay.
her memories, right? Sort of memories of being there. And by painting, she's invoking those memories of being there, and maybe she's there again, right? I mean, that's probably the way I would go with it.
Yeah, but also is there, I mean, I think a lot of us could probably relate to the idea that you could be so invested in a level of creation that you are not just remembering it, but you are literally placing yourself there. And I think the bigness of these paintings and the bigness of the space, the very physical nature of it, I wonder if there's a next step where, in fact, some of it in a state of dispossession is kind of placing herself there as well.
Replacing. Marina, because that goes to the abstract
Yeah, of course.
issue that
Well, I think it's also maybe just worth pointing out something that you had mentioned, which is that she painted standing often, which was a bit unusual, rather than kind of like working over a canvas. But that was very related to the being in a woman who was in her 80s and needing to be able to stand. So I think there's also something interesting about the physicality of these, because we're not just thinking about there was a lot of labor involved in kind of creating a big canvas, especially for someone who's elderly. So I think that also just kind of helps get a better sense of that.
Just for people in the audience, most of those large canvases you are going to see in museums. People create them sitting down. It's sort of that's the way it's done. Sally wanted to have a chair and to have the canvas on the wall because she really had a bad back, which I completely understand, because doing this sitting on the floor, it's tough. Abstract.
Yeah, I think we've already talked a little bit about the ways that they're not, but I think that for many visitors, viewers of this show, they'll see paintings that look very abstract in nature, that look and maybe remind them of modern artists, or you might see the markings of a certain well-known Western modernist that you think of here. So I'd love to just kind of think about what we make of those illusions, and even maybe getting to the idea of are these abstracted works, or are these abstract?
I think we can have an argument about this. Look, when Sally Gabori starts painting, Mornington Island Art Centre is mostly servicing male painters. And I would say most of those painters were also painting what to most eyes we would call abstract paintings. They were very severe. They looked kind of hard-edged, a lot of them. And they were almost all red, black and white, and they were referring very directly to the kinds of markings that would be painted on the body for ceremony. Right? So one of the things that brings up in my mind immediately is there is already a level of abstraction hard-baked into the culture that she's working in. There are designs that have very specific meanings, but they are very specific meanings that are only available to people who are aware of what they mean. The question becomes, are you able to access these? And the entire ceremonial system of revelation is a system where you're learning more about what these designs mean. So these designs can have a surface meaning, they can have a deep meaning. One of the things when I look at this work, it's quite different to that, but it's coming out of a tradition where the notion of abstraction is not a fanciful idea, right? It's not the notion that you can be looking at something and it doesn't have a written or a one-to-one kind of referential meaning isn't alien. And so to me, yes, these are in many ways very personal, very abstract paintings, but these paintings have meaning. And they have a meaning that comes from a broad cultural complex in which the artist is working. Now, it's very tempting to say, oh, look, that looks a lot like a Barnett Newman. and presume that there's something kind of universal in that. And I think that where we need to think really carefully about this question of abstraction is, I think that in some respects there are historical elements, there are things that we can see in these that we are able to read in regards to the movement, the sensuality, the colour, all of those things. But those themselves, like what gets us to the point that you have that painting, has nothing to do with Barnett Newman. It has to do with its own historical trajectory, its own relational apparatuses, its own places. And I think that where this work becomes really interesting to think through is what does it mean? What do those convergences mean? Like, what do they tell us about the human condition? What do they tell us about the world that Sally Gabori was inhabiting alongside the world that we're inhabiting today? This world where goods and people and objects and ideas are moving really fast, right? And are more connected than they have ever been before. What does that abstraction tell us, right? Like, what does it tell us about Sally Gabori's world? What does it tell us about our world? That they're here in New York now, and that we all love them, right? That they're able to speak across that culture.
Actually, that might be a question for the audience.
That might be, yeah.
Right. That might be a question for you.
That's so professorial.
I am
of
not
us,
going
isn't
to
it?
answer his question. Absolutely not.
Why not?
I think I'm really wary of this word abstract, because if you start saying abstract, we all go somewhere, right? We all go to a painter, we all go to a sculpture, we all go somewhere. I think those paintings, they are deliberately done for something, for someone, for a particular audience. And I think it would do it an injustice if we did not highlight that aspect. I mean, listen, I've done this many times. I see people walking out, oh my God, yeah, this looks like so-and-so, it looks like so-and-so. Oh, I could do this, or I could do that. I mean, you know, we all have heard this, right? Well, no, you can't. Guess what? This is not your country. You were not born there. You're not connected there. You cannot evoke this particular place where you went, where you had that history, where you brought your children, where you worked, where you buried your ancestors, etc. So, yeah. So this is why abstract. It just, you can see, it just like makes me like, no. So is this universal? My question would be, why do we want it to be universal? Why don't we want to have the voices, especially of indigenous people, to speak through those paintings? Marina, you are the abstract expert, not me, so it's your turn.
Well, I think this came up in our early conversations because I think it's something that is part of why artwork like this is so popular. But I'm actually thinking of another word which we didn't discuss, which is representational. So these are representational. They represent a place, they represent ideas, they represent a lot of knowledge that Sally Gabori had. But the abstraction piece, I think, also just comes from my other work as a curator of Native American art, and particularly thinking about artists like Sechengu Lakota artist Diani Whitehawk, who really embraces abstraction. And again, I think it's, this is something that we've all talked about separately, but using terms that the artist wouldn't use for their own work is always tricky. But again, Sally Gabori didn't really like to talk about her work. She would say, "This is my country." She would say a title.
But she did say it was an abstraction.
Yeah.
I mean, she did say, "It's my country." So it's my country, and if you pushed her, she would have said, "That's where I went hunting. That's where I dumped my kid for 5 hours." So yeah.
But I think that if we kind of peel that back, like abstraction leads us to something, but it wasn't something that was just invented, in the 20th century by Europeans and Euro-Americans. Abstraction, if we can, look more broadly, how do we understand our world and how do we communicate it to others? And this is why I was referencing Diani Whitehawk. She says it much more eloquently than I am, but this idea that it's not just something that was invented, but that it's this kind of universal human drive to make things that you understand and share them with people. And so I think in a way, it's not realism took a long time, has its own history, but I think that really the abstracting is that we're taking something. This isn't her physical country, right? This isn't her island, but she's making it for us to see. And I think in that way it is like very much an abstraction. But it's not an abstraction the way a Barnett Newman is, right? It's really representing something, and not that all abstract or modern art doesn't come from a place or come from an idea, but it's not the same kind of deep connection, the relationality that we keep kind of referring back to.
And I would say, I mean, each one of these paintings is a universe unto itself, right? And I think that for me, like, some of that question isn't about universality, because I think if you dropped a Sally Gabori in medieval England and you dropped a Barnett Newman, you know, in the next room of the palace, people would walk in and be like, oh my God, what is these awful things, right? That's historical. We're in a different historical moment to but we're in a historical moment that we are sharing. I mean, that's the important part of this. So to me, some of those questions come down to exactly what Marina was saying, is honouring what is the communicative intent here? What is the universe that we are being able to glimpse in this work? And I think that thinking about these historical trajectories, these universes, to me, why that is important is really because it does allow us some space to think about the difference. Because we are not placing, you know, you can't place this within a historical trajectory that is the same as Euro-American abstraction. It just doesn't work. It's not following those rules, as you pointed out. It's referential in its entirely own historical ways. But with all of that in mind, when we come and see them in here and we have that impact, you look at them and you're like, what are they communicating? I guess that's what I want to know. I want to know when you look at them and you're like, like, how are they able to communicate? How is a woman in her 80s who didn't speak a lot of English, had very little, well, she never came to New York, right? How did she produce paintings that make people in New York come in and go,